We're parking Ephesians for July. In fact, the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. It's a nice natural break for us at the end of chapter 3, so we are going to shelve that till after the summer. A little break because people are here, there, and everywhere. And we're going to do something a little bit different for the month of July. Now, the text that we're going to look at today is printed on a sheet over at the side. So if you've not got a Bible with you, or you're someone who likes to scribble on the text, you can go and get one of those. And if you've got a Bible with you, then turn to the book of Esther. And if you're new to the Bible, in the contents page is your friend. You find the book of Esther in the first half of the Bible. Book of Esther. Hands up if you like a good story. Lots of people like, is there any favourite stories? What's your favourite story? Yeah, I love Narnia as well.
What, like any Bible?
Any story.
By far, I think Genesis.
Genesis. Good lad. Any others? Narnia and Genesis. Lord of the Rings, also a good story. One of my favourite stories, without a shadow of a doubt, is the book of Esther. Since I was a little kid, the book of Esther is just a great story. It's an old story. It's set about 500 years before Jesus was around. Not a new story, but it's a brilliant story. And in some ways, it's a story that could be kind of straight out of the scheme. There's loads of stuff in it I think we're going to relate to. There's a whole bunch of backstabbing and lying and anger and hatred and rage. There's this evil sort of pantomime figure who, when he comes on the stage, we're meant to go boo about. There's a prominent female leader in this story. There's a real dust to glory hero in the story. There's attempted genocide. There's stupidity. And there's royalty. And there's conspiracy. There's feasts. And there's sex. And there's death. And there's not a single mention of God. And as we read this story together over the month of July, with God completely out of the picture, we're going to be asking this question. Well, where are you, God? If we look at this story, we can't see you. Who's in control of what's going on in these pages? And I think for most of us who would describe ourselves as very average people, our answer to that question, who's in control, is probably a resounding, not me. We don't feel in control very much of the time. We feel more often powerless and insignificant. And even in those times when we do kind of feel like we've got it together, like we are in control, it only takes a brief and unexpected diagnosis, or a freak accident, or a disobedient child, like the life I'm living at the moment, or something completely unexpected, a reduction in your dole money, an outbreak of coronavirus in our church again. It only takes one of these things to make us realise we are not in control. We're not in control of what's going to happen to us. We feel vulnerable often. We feel like we're in this constant fight or flight mode, some of us. And this feeling, I think, can be especially true if you're a Christian today. We live in a country, we live in a culture, and we live in a community in Graceman that in all kinds of ways is actually really opposed to what we believe and really hostile to the God that we worship. Life's hard enough already, isn't it? Well, being a Christian can actually make it harder. And looking around us at this harsh, hostile world, I find myself asking, just like in the book of Esther, well, who's in control? What's going to happen to me and my family? And where on earth is God? Well, from page 1 of Esther, you're left in no doubt whatsoever as to who thinks he's in charge. If you look at verse 1, it tells us, Xerxes, the Xerxes, it says, was king over this huge empire that spanned 127 different provinces, from India to Ethiopia. This was pretty much all of the known world at the time. His empire was so massive, he actually just used the word world to describe his kingdom. This was in every way the kingdom of the worlds. And the whole of chapter 1 presents us with this kingdom of the world. And so we're going to read together verses 1 to 9 of chapter 1. And I want you to look out for what the kingdom of the world looks like. Esther chapter 1 verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry and marble, mother of pearl and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold. Each one was different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink without restriction, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Now, in the first 9 verses of chapter 1, what do we see of this kingdom of the world? There's so much to see. This feast is big and bold and in many ways beautiful. Here's the first thing that I think is right before our eyes. This is an unavoidable kingdom. It's an unavoidable kingdom. Said this empire spanned pretty much all of the known world. If you were born in 483 BC, chances are you were born as part of this empire. There's nowhere to escape from the power of this king and this kingdom. 127 provinces. This was the world. You're born into this world, and there is one way out of this world, and nowhere to hide in the meantime. The kingdom of the world is all-encompassing. It is impossible to escape, and it wants you to know just exactly who's in charge. It's unavoidable. Here's the second thing. It's powerful. It's unavoidable. It's also powerful. Here in these first 9 verses, King Xerxes is sat on his big, powerful throne, and before him are all the leaders of the armed forces, all the noble people, all the governors of the provinces. They're sat before him having a meal. This is a power scene. This is what's going on. He's only been king for just over 1,000 days, and here comes a 180-day long party to show off the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. He's obviously quite impressive himself. It's not been that long to celebrate. Now, this kind of kingdom that we see in these first 9 verses, this is the kind of kingdom that makes little people feel even smaller. Relate to that? Sometimes our community may feel like an inescapable world. It can feel like somewhere where we are really small fry and really insignificant and trapped. Just got to toe the line, therefore, we think. We've got to keep our heads down, not rock the boat, and not try to resist. Have you felt that? Maybe, though, you're sat there and you're thinking, hang on, why would I want to resist? Why would I want to resist? What's this guy on about? Why would I want to resist the power of the world when it just looks so good? Because thirdly, this kingdom of the world is also really attractive. Really beautiful. And this 180-day feast that Xerxes throws ends. He decides, let's throw another one. Just a week this time. Week-long party. And here comes everyone from the citadel. Everyone's invited. The great and the small. All of the people of high station. And all of the butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, and even like wee Jimmy from down the street. Everyone's invited. The king wants to show off to the great unwashed in this week-long feast. And so, out come the poppy out the eyes, in come the people, and they see all this splendour, this world of white cotton and fine linen and silver and marble and gold and gemstones and wine from the king's own cellar. Now, imagine that you live in a grotty house with a dirt floor, and then in for a week, you're welcomed into this gathering. It's pretty special. Luxury that seems to never run out. Who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want that? It's jaw-droppingly beautiful. The price for participation in the king's party is all of this. It's beautiful. Why wouldn't it? Now, alright, it's minging how wasteful it is. And it's clearly all just for show. It's really, really pretentious. But boy, is it hard not to say. Why is it hard not to say yes to it? It looks amazing. Now, the tradition in these days was if the king drank from his cup, you drank from your cup. And if the king did not drink from his cup, you certainly did not drink from your cup. But here we find that the king passes a law. He passes a law to say there is no compulsion. This is a law to say there is no law. You can drink as much or as little as you like, only because I say you can. Be free, because I say you can. And to wee Jimmy, that sounds brilliant, because he can get bashing about the Pinot Grigio that's in the king's cellars as much as he wants for a week. Now, there are some things that we know that are wrong, but that look good, right? Things that look amazing. Even if you do know that the self-serving powers of the world are only out to make themselves look good, the things that they can give you make you kind of happy to go along with it. So it might be that you are being asked to lie to back up a friend in order to maintain that friendship with them. Or it might be your dealer who will slip something to you for free in order to keep you on the hook next week. Or it could be just kind of ignorantly turning a blind eye to all the suffering in the world in order to maintain our own comfort. There are always perks when going along with the ways of the world. It looks good. It looks amazing. But with this unavoidable, powerful, attractive kingdom plastered before our eyes, not all is as it seems. The queen, called Vashti, is busy hosting a meal for the women in verse 9. And so we're going to read from verse 10. Who have I got? Irene. Irene's going to come and read from verse 10. Thank you, Irene. Do I need to do anything with this mic, Andy? Great, thank you.
On this seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits and wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehulam, Bilsa, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zephyr, and Carpus, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. When Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong not only against the king, but and the people of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue.
Thanks, Irene. That saves me from having to read all the names. That's why you drew the short straw there. Thank you so much. I hope you caught in those verses that appearance of power that we saw in the previous section doesn't really match the reality. We find that the reality is very different. So here's the king, in a lot of feasting, in a lot of drinking, a bit steaming, and he decides it's a good idea to get his queen, his wife, to come over to the party. So he sends off 7 servants, go and get her. Not really an invite to the party, so much as a summons to the party. Seems like that there is no compulsion, do what you like, doesn't apply to his wife. She was a trophy wife, it says she was good looking. But see, this Eastern culture meant that she should have been lovely to look at for her husband. Not paraded out in front of parties. He's commanding her to do something she would have found shameful. The suggestion is actually that the command to bring her wearing her royal crown is a command to bring her only wearing her royal crown. That's the suggestion. He wanted to show her off like he was showing off his cups and his couches and his curtains and all of these things. He said romance was dead, eh? That's what he wanted to do. He's not interested in her personality. To him, she was a possession to parade. And so in the face of this power, in the face of this mighty, mighty empire, verse 12 comes and cracks begin to show. Standing before this mighty, powerful king, Vashti goes, no. She just says no. The reality is that the kingdom of the world is not really in control. Vashti just refused. Doesn't say why she refused, you can guess, but she just says no. And in a moment, this huge empire that looked so powerful is left totally powerless. The king can't even get his own wife to come to a party. It's like pulling down the trousers of the school bully, isn't it? The playground. It's humiliating. And guess what? Everyone's there. He invited them. She shows that it's possible to resist this kingdom. Now, this refusal stings badly. And the kingdom that did look attractive now shows its ugly side. It shows its ugly volatility. Look at the end of verse 12. The king becomes enraged, it says. His anger burned within him. Can't control his wife. He can't control himself. And the king just flies off the handle. It's the response of a kingdom that does not like to be resisted. Refusal brings rage. And so in his rage, the angry king gets his advisors together. Ironically, they're called wise men. It's ironic because they show themselves to be thick as mints. Wise men, come, let us hatch a plan. But it turns out to be a plan that ultimately makes the king look even more laughable. His kingdom's not in control. It is ugly and volatile, but it's also laughable. They put 2 and 2 together, they come up with 6. Their assumption here is Vashti's disobedience is going to spread like wildfire. Every woman in the empire is going to look to her example and rebel against her husband. There's going to be a worldwide destabilizing uprising of wives. It's funny. It's meant to be. It's laughable. The king would have been much better asking these men's wives, if you ask me. Now, the laws of the Medes and Persians that you see in verse 19 being mentioned, once they were passed, they could never be undone. And the whole scene here gets much more ironic as Vashti is now legally banned forever from the king's presence. For what? Refusing to come into the king's presence. He wanted her to come. Now she'll never come again. You'll find a better new queen, say his advisors. Presumably better means more obedient, because Vashti, it says, was stunningly beautiful. The kingdom propaganda machine kicks into top gear. Everybody in the whole empire is notified of what's happened in their own native language. And again, ironically, what do they end up doing? They tell every person in the whole empire the king's had his trousers pulled down around his ankles in front of the whole party of people. The kingdom that appeared unavoidable and powerful and attractive, in reality, is shown to have no control, an ugly temper, and ultimately no substance to it whatsoever. And at this point in the story, we're supposed to realize that visible and hidden, or visible and invisible, does not equal reality and fantasy. The reality here in chapter 1 is much different to what is obviously seen. And while King Xerxes is now dead and buried, this kingdom of the world remains very much the same. It's a kingdom that is big and bold and in our face. It looks unavoidable. It looks really powerful. And it looks in many ways seductively attractive. But in reality, it's empty and it's ugly. In chapter 1, and very often in our lives, we ask, where are you, God? In those times when what we see around us is just so ungodlike. Where are you? This is not what God is like. And because God is so obviously absent, he becomes obvious in his absence. Because this kingdom of the world that's so in our faces is such a contrast to the invisible, hidden, and humble kingdom of God. It would be very easy to think that what's most visible is what's real. But we've already seen that's not the case. There is, in fact, another kingdom in this chapter. And while Xerxes, as the king, lived in extravagance and he lived in luxury, there is this other king who came born as a baby into what? Riches, poverty. To live a life of service and suffering, and to die a death that he did not deserve. And while this King Xerxes shows himself to be an insecure, volatile tyrant of a king, this other king is kind and he's gentle and he's fair at all times. And while this King Xerxes couldn't even get his own wife to come to a party, this unmentioned king in this passage, King Jesus, one who is all-powerful, this king laid down his life in our place for our sin, in order that he might, by his immeasurable love, persuade us to come. Not to come and be shamed like the king wanted his wife to come, but to come and have our shame taken away. This is a king who hung on a cross naked in your place. He's able to change hearts in a way that the kingdom of the world never could. And this king and this kingdom might not be as immediately in your face, but they're there. And they're real. And whether you see it or not, only King Jesus is really in control. All the hostility and the opposition to God that we see, it is laughable. But King Jesus, though he is patient, and though he is kind, and though he did allow himself to be mocked and laughed at as he hung on the cross, he's not to be taken lightly. This Jesus is to be followed wholeheartedly. This King Jesus, though he is very, very, very patient, will one day condemn all of those who stand in opposition to him, rejecting his gracious call to come and receive life from him to hell for eternity. He is not a God to be laughed at. He is not a king to be trifled with. Which kingdom do you want to be a part of? They stand in stark contrast. Now you might be thinking, that's fine and well, but I think you're plucking that from thin air. Because I don't really see that. I don't see any mention of God in these verses. I don't really see God in these verses. I definitely don't see what God's up to in these verses. It's just a random story. But we're going to see how God has been silently moving and maneuvering, moving the pieces in this story in just the right way. So, you still with me? We're going to read from chapter 2. Would you believe it? 2 chapters in one sermon. Charlie, you're going to come and read. Chapter 2, first 18 verses. Sorry.
Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatment be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, who he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had the charge of the harem. But she pleased him and won his favour. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background, because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the woman, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go down, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favour of everyone who saw her. He was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favour and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality.
Thanks, Charlie. If chapter 1 was about the kingdom of the world, chapter 2 is about God's people living in that kingdom. As we come to the start of chapter 2, we find Xerxes has sobered up a little bit, and he's expressing some kind of regret about the fact he's never going to see his really beautiful wife ever again. Maybe he was a little bit rash. Now, perhaps he was moping around the palace, and so his servants suggest to him a plan to try and cheer him up. Have a competition, O great king. And so at first sight, we see this thing that looks a bit like a Miss World beauty contest. From all over the world, women who are beautiful and young and unmarried, they're rounded up for the king to come and take his pick from, like some weird reality TV show. That actually is not that weird a reality TV show these days. First prize in this competition, the title of queen. Good prize. Now we sidestep in verse 5 just for a moment to meet this other character. It says he's a Jew, which means he's part of the people of Israel, God's chosen people in the Old Testament. His name's Mordecai. And Mordecai has this orphan cousin called Esther, who he's raising himself as his own daughter. And together we find Mordecai and Esther painting this picture of God's people in the kingdom of the world. And so if you're a Christian this afternoon, this is what you often look like. We see. The first thing we notice about them is that they are far from home. Look at verse 5. 4 times it says there that Mordecai is an exile. Susa is his address, but it's not his home. He was outside the land that God promised to Israel because they had been conquered by the Babylonians. They had been either slaughtered or carried off as slaves. And now he's living amongst the Persians who had conquered the Babylonians. Exile defines Mordecai. He's an immigrant. He's a foreigner. He is someone who sticks out like a sore thumb. He's like an American in Scotland. He's not meant to be there. He's in this world kingdom, but he's not of this world kingdom. Now, I wonder if you've ever felt out of place as a Christian. Have you ever been that weird Bible-bashing Christian? You are far from home. Because people are far from home, but they're also really weak. Mordecai's not just defined as an exile, he's also defined as someone defeated and carried away. Now we find that his adopted daughter Esther is going to get carried off as well. She's joining him in this. She was beautiful, it says in verse 7. She was young, she was unmarried, and that makes her a prime candidate for this king's competition. And so as this command goes out from the palace, she's taken in with the rest of them, gathered up like a meat market for the king. Applications not necessary, no choice. Orphaned, exiled, and now taken from her uncle, Esther is the picture of weakness. And I want you to think, look around the room and think about those who are ill and poor and suffering and stressed and tempted, confused, grieving, weary, sad, addicted, aging, anxious, few. We're a hand-picked group of weak people. That's what we are. Far from home, weak. Esther's also exploited. There's a dark side to this contest. A year of scrubbing up before spending a single night with the king. This wasn't a beauty competition, it was a bedroom competition. Each woman would wait for her one night to impress the king. If he liked her, he might call for her again. If not, she's going to spend her life in some palace back room, not allowed to remarry, not loved, not allowed to leave. Everything rested on this one night. It's Ming, but it's designed to make these women try really hard to impress. Here's a kingdom that values physical appearance and sexual performance above everything else. This is not a new thing. And here's Esther, exploited like this object. You might have experienced that as you're sat in this room today. The world's maybe treated you like a commodity, something to be used and then just disposed of. Because that is how a world without God, a world where God is not there to be seen, that is how a world that is without God treats people. But there's something more going on here too. God's people are far from home and weak and exploited. They're also caught in this tension of dual citizenship. Let me show you what I mean. As residents of the Persian Empire, but also citizens of God's people, we find Mordecai and Esther pulled in two directions. They faced a choice. What do? Do we assimilate to the world around us, or do we resist its power and face the consequences? You have to make that choice. These characters, actually what we find is pretty little resistance. Mordecai, it says, is a Babylonian name. We find in verse 7, Esther doesn't go by her Jewish name either. They're in Susa because of the exile, but by this point, the exile's been over a while. Loads of Jews have returned. It seems like Mordecai's chosen to stay. There's a foot in both worlds. Mordecai tells Esther, keep your identity as a Jew a secret. She's all too happy to go with that. In fact, we find that Esther's on the charm offensive. She's actively trying to please her ungodly captors. It says she won the favour of the guy in charge. It says she won the favour of all who saw her. She was likeable, but she was also trying really hard to win this competition. As we come to verse 16, 4 years have passed since Vashti's got the kind of boot out of the palace. 4 years of winning. And Esther's turn comes. And here she doesn't resist, she pleases the king, and against all the odds, Esther is crowned as queen. The king is buzzing. He's got himself a new wife. Completely unaware that she's a Jew. Now we feel some of that tension that Mordecai and Esther felt, and we have dual citizenship. We are here, we are in this world, we are, though not of this world, if we're Christians. We're faced constantly with this choice. Do I assimilate? Do I look exactly the same as everything around me to fit in? Or do I resist and live distinctively? Compromise or contrast? What do I do? I wonder what your life would look like if it was written down like Esther and Mordecai's. What mine look like? Chapter 2, Esther and Mordecai both seem really content to play the empire's game, no matter how ugly it really is. And we're tempted to go then, well, they're pretty rubbish role models, aren't they? And that may be so. And so we need to be clear, right at the start of our studies in Esther, Mordecai and Esther aren't really here for us as examples. They're not really there for us as patterns of how we should live. They're real people. And they're here to show us what God's doing through flawed and cowardly and weak people. And we get a glimpse of what he's up to as we read to the end of chapter 2. So let's read. Verse 19 is where we're picking up. Verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles, ouch, All this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. They look weak and vulnerable, far from home, and exploited. What's the reality? The reality in this story is that Mordecai was at just the right place, at his work, when he discovers a plot to assassinate the king. He's presented all of a sudden with an opportunity to show himself to be the loyal servant, and all of a sudden Esther's new position becomes really useful. She passes a message to the king. Mordecai is now the saviour of the king of the world. Suddenly the kingdom owes a favour to these two secret Jews. And it's no coincidence that Mordecai and Esther find themselves in these positions. At just the right time, they've been placed in just the right place. Not manoeuvred like objects, like the king treats these women, but placed as people who God is going to work through to do his work. And looking at the puny people of God, living in this powerful kingdom of the world, we can feel really vulnerable. Think about our wee church. Think about the months ahead. Summer holidays. What does that mean? People are going to be heading off all over the place. You feel that, actually. Who's going to fill the pews? You don't have pews. Who's going to sit in the seats? Who's going to set up the church? Who's going to play the music? Who's going to care for people who are having a hard time? You lot have it really hard because you've got to listen to me preach instead of Andy. Feels tough. You feel it when COVID hits and a bunch of people aren't there. It's noticeable. We feel small. We feel vulnerable. We feel our shortage of leaders when one of them gets cancer. We feel vulnerable. Sometimes it feels like we're hanging just by a thread. Our chances of survival look small. But Esther would teach us that though we might look vulnerable, God's people are actually the most secure people there are. It might be in the background, it might be that it's all taking place out with our view, but God is working away, using even the evil actions of his enemies, and using even our stupidity and unfaithfulness to accomplish his purposes of saving his people. God is at work. We often ask, where are you, God, when we're not feeling in control? We aren't in control. The world, the kingdom of the world, isn't in control either. And even if you can't see it, only King Jesus is really in control. And he's not like Xerxes. He's a good king. He's the one who offers life. He's the one who gave his life to bring you life. And because he's the only one who's really in control, his weak-looking, weak-feeling, vulnerable-looking people are actually the only secure people. And this is how the story of Esther begins.